Good morning, everybody. Can you hear me okay up in the back? Okay, good. So a few things really quickly. I just wanted to give the shout out to Daniel and the other organizers first for putting today together. I know he's in his breakout session presently, and the scheduling gods have been unkind because I wanted to watch his talk, but instead I'm stuck giving mine. So, yeah, I do enough event organization that I know what a huge undertaking it is to put one of these things together. And it is, I must say, a refreshing change to actually get to be at one of these things and not be super anxious about the catering. So thanks again for having me. I also wanted to give a quick shout out to some of my collaborators. So this work is integrated and part of some ongoing work that I have with Richard Wu and also with John Vervaeke, who will be giving one of the keynotes later today. Yes, so I want to sort of acknowledge that part of it. And it looks like it might be part of ongoing work that is coming out of our lab, eventually, hopefully, the Consciousness and Wisdom Studies Laboratory here at U of T. So, yeah, all of that credit where credit is due. So a little bit about me. Who am I? So I'm Anderson Todd, not Todd Anderson. Anderson's my first name. I'm the guy with the backwards name. But just remember Anderson Cooper. He's done me big favors. That'll help you. My background, I am a practicing psychotherapist. I am a researcher, and so I do work in, as I said, consciousness, wisdom, altered states, mystical experiences, so this is very much in my wheelhouse. And I'm a lecturer here at the university, and mapping the mind is really pretty much the most succinct description I could give of what my jam is academically. I taught the capstone cognitive science consciousness course last year, and this year I'm going to be teaching the hypotheses of the unconscious, so between the two I've pretty much got the mind mapped out in at least two big chunks. This work, on the other hand, comes pretty squarely out of sort of an earlier critique that I have. Now I'm very interested, as this giant mouthful will tell you, in neurophenomenology as a method of mapping the mind. And what are we getting into when we talk about that? Well, there's an earlier sort of term use of neurophenomenology, but what I'm really interested in is Francisco Varela's use of the term. And there what we have is the idea that we can learn something really integral that allows us to knit together subjective and objective experience in some way by having observers who are highly trained, right, in being able to observe what's going on in their own mind and describe it, and then matching that up with other techniques of scientific inquiry. So the classic version that comes out of Varela is the use of mindfulness, and mindfulness meditators, right, are, you know, sort of trained in a certain kind of connoisseurship of their own mind, if they're good, if they're long-term meditators, and so applying those tools in to be able to make very fine-grained, right, observations about what's going on in your subjective awareness, right, and then being able to map those over in some way, shape, or form with, say, imaging techniques, right, being able to put people into MRI or fMRI, and if they say, you know, I'm in such and such a state of consciousness, we can map that, and then we begin to get some sense of what's going on so that we can, you know, bridge this classic gap. So that's classic neurophenomenology. Now, I've been interested in a long time with neurophenomenological interventions. So I'm interested in weird stuff like lucid dreaming, okay, and neurostimulation, TDCS or TMS, transcranial magnetic stimulation, or transcranial direct current stimulation, the different kinds of stimulation regimes. I'm interested in lucid dreaming. Again, it's an altered state, right, but we're just beginning to have science about it. And I'm particularly interested, and have been for a long time, in the possibilities of psychedelics within neurophenomenology. Because if we have somebody who's more or less trained in sort of observing those states, but we can induce them fairly reliably, it suddenly opens up the pool of people. So if we're talking about something like mystical experiences, right, instead of having to rely on the kind of people that are having them spontaneously and hoping they have them when you're in the lab, or the people who have trained in meditation for 25 years so you can, you know, say, okay, do it now. Do it now while we're watching. Instead, we're getting to this place where we can administer such and such a dose by body weight of psilocybin and reliably being able to reproduce those, right? The work of Griffiths and so on and so forth. However, I think there are two really serious problems with psychedelic neurophenomenology, and the problems together constitute a barrier to really turning this into a science, okay? So if you want to analogize this, I feel like psychedelic science right now is in a place where, because we don't have very fine-grained data, what we're basically doing is we're in the pre-Darwin period of just having a giant glass cabinet full of dried finches. And we just pull them out and we're like, look, this is weird. Look at this one, it's weird, right? And that's kind of where we are neurophenomenologically. We give people things and then we say, look, it's weird. But what we don't have is system. We don't have any systematic way of really mapping this. And there's a couple of reasons why, okay? So, where is this? Ha! They hit it. Okay, so these are the two main problems that I see as sort of plaguing the field as it stands, okay? The receptor specificity problem and the molecular variation problem. Okay, so the receptor specificity problem is just this. Let's say that we take, the kind of standard flagship chemical that started most of this research off, really, LSD-25. Now, we talk about LSD-25 as being part of, affecting the serotonin system, that it's serotonergic. But that's actually like a really gross undersimplification. In fact, it affects the whole adrenal system, it affects all of the dopaminergic transmitters, and it affects like 20 different kinds of serotonergic transmitters, right, all through the brain. So we don't have any really specific site that LSD interacts with, which makes it incredibly hard, even when we give it to somebody, to map it onto what's going on in their brain. And you can see some of this if you look at some of the published papers that are starting to do imaging, right? I was at a talk at KMH the other day where we were looking at this research, and you have the pictures of brains, and it's basically like, okay, here's the brain without LSD, good, and here it is with LSD, and look, it's all lit up. Well, what does that tell us? Not much, right? Yes, something's going on, but they probably knew that. The point is that there are so many different receptor sites, and the connection patterns are so sort of various that it makes it incredibly difficult to be able to tease apart. Now, I think that trying to really, really localize it, right? We're not looking for some sugar cube-sized chunk in the brain that handles LSD. But before we can make sort of meaningful maps of how this stuff is interacting, we need at the very least to be able to pin it down to some kind of localizable site, right, of interaction. And most of the chemicals that people are using to do this research, they're not good for that. They hit too many different types of receptors. So that's problem one, that's receptor specificity. Problem two is the molecular variation problem, okay? So most of these chemicals, such as they are, interact with your brain by imitating or substituting for or interacting with existing neurotransmitters. But the problem is that the neurotransmitters in question are radically different in shape. So the fact that the LSD transmitter, or the LSD chemical interacts, right, with the same sites in some sense as serotonin and a bunch of other things, the chemicals are two totally different shapes. And we don't have any kind of predictive mechanism. It's not like we can look at the shape of LSD and go, that one, that, because it has that thing on the side. It's not like that, right? They're two totally different shapes, and in a certain sense, the analogy that I have used is that it's a little bit like we're investigating the receptor sites, okay, and there's the cross of a Phillips head screw in there, and we're investigating it with a Phillips head screw, the natural chemical, or a pair of pliers in the dark, and we're just sort of jamming it at this receptor site. We don't have any way of sort of mapping the differences in shape, and the differences in shape between the two chemicals are quite radical. So between these two problems, what we end up with is the dried finches in the cabinet. It's just we give people chemicals and then we say, look, wasn't that weird? And certainly there's lots of interesting fallout from that, right? We can look at the knock-on effects that these things have, and of course there's an increasing amount of research in that sense in terms of the long-term effects and the clinical effects, right? All of which is very interesting. But what we don't have is much of a categorical science. So I have a proposition about how we might begin to address those two problems. So in the first case, receptor specificity, there are indeed a class of psychoactive chemicals that are far more specific than the kinds of things that we typically use, right? And if any of you saw me give my talk last year, I talked a little bit about one of those receptor sites, the kappa opioid site. So kappa opioid receptor agonists, okay? Naturally in your brain, the kappa opioid receptors, well, we're not exactly sure what they do, to be honest. If you give somebody the natural kappa opioid chemical, dynorphin A, it produces intense dysphoria, makes them sad, and it's very unpleasant. We're not exactly sure what that does. But we do have a pretty good sense of what it does when you give them a different agonist, salvinorin A. And if any of you have ever experienced salvia, it is the most powerful naturally occurring hallucinogen in nature. It is chemically utterly different than something like LSD. And if you saw my talk last year, I talked about how a slight miscalculation in terms of dosage led to me destroying the universe temporarily in my mind. So they're very strong. For that reason, because they're relatively strong, because they're very short acting, about 5 minutes worth of action, and because they only interact at this very narrow site, kappa opioid A receptors, right? I've proposed that in the past as being a good site where we should be doing work. You're tagging a really, really specific area. And I'm not actually going to get into the rest of the receptor specificity problem all that much. Suffice it to say that I think that the kappa opioid receptors are a key place. They seem to have really fundamental impact on the way in which we construct the world. And for more on that, I would just refer you to the video link for my talk for last year. It's the other problem that is of particular interest to me. So core agonists is my proposed solution for receptor specificity. But for the molecular variation problem, for this question about these huge differences in terms of the shape of the molecule, for that we've got to go into considerably weirder territory, which is to say we got to take a short detour into quantum biology. So quantum biology used to be something of an oxymoron in respectable terms. Most researchers up until very recently considered biological systems to be almost entirely classically driven, thermodynamic and chemical and so on and so forth, but too big for quantum effects to have any meaningful impact within them. But in the last bunch of years, there's been some really interesting work coming out showing that, in fact, quantum effects are playing not just an important, but in many cases an integral role within biological systems. So, as some quick examples, photosynthesis, as it turns out, could not achieve the level of efficiency and energy transfer that it does without harnessing quantum coherence. And to underline how really weird that is, right? Normally when we do the kinds of experiments to produce quantum coherence in the lab, we have to chill things to like a fraction of a thousandth of a degree above absolute zero and maintain incredibly sterile. But somehow life is achieving that same effect, achieving quantum coherence, and it's doing so in, as they say, a warm, wet environment, right? These messy biological systems. But if you crunch it through, you do the math, there's just basically no way to account for it other than coherence, at least within current theory. So in some way, the biological system, right, in photosynthesis, the plant, is somehow seeking out every possible path at once to settle out its energy packets, and that's how it gets the high efficiency that it does. And if it didn't, it wouldn't work, right? So it's an integral quantum effect. The other one that got quite a bit of attention is, interestingly, in the bird navigation. So specifically the navigation patterns of the European robin. So, as many people know, of course, robins, navigate seasonally and so on and so forth. And for a long time, there was the proposition that robins did this by tracking magnetic fields, right? By the Earth's magnetic fields. Simple enough. Except that robins don't show the kinds of biological markers that you normally see in magnetic sensing organisms, right? So like a crayfish has a bunch of tiny iron particles on top of its brain, and it detects magnetism basically just by having these little iron filings in its head, pulling around. So if you're a horrible person, you can hold a magnet close to a crayfish and it deeply, deeply confuses it. Robins don't have this. And a bunch of experimentation later, and I won't bore you with the full experiment, what they determined is that it looks like the best candidate to explain robin's ability to detect the Earth's magnetic field relies on quantum entanglement, a phenomenon that's, again, it's like surprisingly difficult. I mean, you can do it on a desktop model now because science is awesome, but normally you require these highly controlled environments to do it, and yet somehow, and this is the going theory, the robins have a chemical inside their eyeballs that produces a pair of entangled electrons at either end of the molecule. Those electrons interfere with free, unentangled electrons in the magnetic field, and when they do, they darken, the chemical darkens, and then the robin can see magnetic fields by harnessing quantum entanglement, right? Again, it's the kind of thing where evolution excels at taking advantage of tiny effects, but really until the last decade, we didn't have any clear sense that this kind of stuff was occurring in life. And it looks increasingly like, in fact, life may be harnessing these kinds of, frankly, unusual quantum effects, across the board. The one that I'm particularly interested in for the molecular variation problem is the vibration theory of olfaction, which is to say quantum smell. Now, it's a contentious theory. And there's been, frankly, a lot of turf war and dug in trenches back and forth on the lines in the papers. I can give you kind of a brief summary of that stuff. So the idea is this. Smell is weird. We don't really know what's going on with it. Vision, reasonably well understood. Hearing, reasonably well understood. Smell has problems in our accounts of it. They are sort of inadequate accounts. They don't explain all the data very well. So one of the things that really jumps out with smell, okay, if the dominant account of smell theory is the key lock model, okay, it's fundamentally shape-based. So the idea is you've got a receptor, and the receptor has a particular shape, right, and here comes cinnamon or whatever, and click, and it clicks and the receptor fires, right? Pretty straightforward. But there are unusual anomalies in the way that smell works. So for one thing, receptors, again, require, as I mentioned earlier, receptor specificity to some extent. And it seems like we don't have nearly enough receptor types to account for all the things that we can discriminate through smell. And it doesn't simply seem to be a question of sort of additive influence. It's not that my ability to pick up pumpkin spice is my ability to pick up cinnamon and allspice? Mace? What is that? I don't know. But anyway, it doesn't seem to be quite that simple. It seems like there are actual distinct things. Not to mention the fact that some of the things that you can pick up with distinct phenomenology are like so strange and specific. Cut grass. There's a single molecule that makes that smell. There's a big molecule that, I kid you not, I've not smelled it myself, but it is described as having the smell of mango on hot black rubber. That's one molecule. Think about that for a second, okay? And this is not the smell that you would get from smelling mangoes baking on a tire. It's some single molecule that, for some reason, if key lock is right, you have a receptor to pick that up. But there's other issues with this, okay? So if you're thinking about receptor specificity, you really have to think of this in evolved terms, right? Receptors evolve and they pick up specific things. So we can analogize that to digestion, okay? So think about this for a second, right? You have a set of enzymes in your system that are designed to tackle the things that are in your diet, right? This is why your dog can't eat chocolate. It doesn't have the enzymes, it can't break the chocolate down, the chocolate kills it. Right? Likewise, it's why if you're lactose intolerant, right, a date to the ice cream parlor ends very badly for you because you don't have the enzymes you need. So there's a biological specificity to which enzymes you have and what you can break down, and right, that's been worked out through evolution. But there's a class of chemicals that we can smell instantly that didn't exist in nature at all. So you know that smell that's in cleaning products? It's like really fresh. It's like that fresh smell. Okay, it's totally synthetic, it didn't exist in nature, and it didn't exist until the early 20th century. They cooked it up in a lab. But immediately, boom, you can pick it up. Fresh. Now, that has some real problems, because why would we have receptors to pick up, right? Why would we have the surplus capacity in olfaction to pick up chemicals that didn't even exist? Now, I'll also tag for a second that there is in fact an entire class of these chemicals, and there are other unusual properties, right, that turn up here when you start getting into smell. So the key lock model is sort of deemed to have some problems, but it's the dominant model, right, shape. But in 1996, an Italian researcher named Luca Turin started looking at an alternate model of olfaction called the vibration model of olfaction, right, so-called quantum smell. And what he basically proposed was that the receptors in the nose are acting a bit like spectrographs, that they're not just picking up on shape properties, but rather that they're picking up on other quantum properties, that they're picking up on the vibrational rate of the molecules in question. And that by doing so, right, when things plug in, the energy packet that gets transferred, and he's proposing quantum tunneling as the sort of mechanism here, but again, as most good debates in science are, it's very contentious. There have been some physicists who have said, that could actually be. and there are others who are saying that, no, it doesn't quite make sense. It's very back and forth. But he's got some very interesting results. So here was his first experiment. He said, okay, let's assume for a second that it's not just key lock. Let's assume that we are also relying on some kind of quantum, secondary vibration quantum property. How could we test for that? And he came up with a very clever experiment. I love this experiment. So what he did was, he took fruit flies, Drosophila, and fruit flies are stupid, but you can train them. If you shock them, you can train them to avoid things, right? It's horrible, but that's how it works. So what he did was, he took an odorant that Drosophila really liked, a fruit ester, okay? And he produced two versions of that odorant. One that's just the normal version, and the other, he applied a process called deuteration, okay? So if you guys know the term heavy water, right? Have you ever heard about heavy water that we use in reactors? Heavy water is just the H2O, right, the Mickey Mouse molecule, where instead of hydrogen, the two H's, you have deuterium. And deuterium is just, instead of just having a proton and an electron, you've got a proton, a neutron, and an electron, right? So it's heavy, pretty simple. So heavy water is just, right, the two hydrogens replaced with deuterium, so there are a couple extra neutrons, it's got more mass, but electrochemically it's basically identical, right? The shape is the same. The electrochemical property is the same. Chemically it should behave in the same way. So what he did was, he took this fruit ester and he substituted deuterium. He made it heavier. Now that heaviness of it, now he's got heavy fruit smell and unheavy fruit smell. And that heaviness will register in a slightly slower quantum vibration. So then he exposed the Drosophila to the versions, right, to the deuterated or undeuteriated version, and shocked them, and shocked them, and shocked them, and shocked them. And then he just put them in a thing where they were released into a T-tube, right, T-shaped tube, where they had the opportunity to choose. Now, if key lock held, in theory, they should have been indistinguishable, right? They both had the same shape, they both had the same electrochemical properties. But if indeed the Drosophila were capable of picking up this vibration property, well, then it would be a clear choice, right? They would avoid the thing that they could distinguish, and they did, consistently. So it seemed that at the very least fruit flies were capable of picking this up. Now, critics of leukoturin have said, well, look, the fact that fruit flies and we have generally the same receptors, you know, there's no proof that human olfaction works this way, right? Just because fruit flies do. Okay, fine. We usually start with non-human models and we move into human. He had a remarkably good sense of smell, and he claimed that he personally could tell the difference between deuterated and undeuterited chemicals, right? Between the heavy version and the regular version. And they ran some tests, and it turns out with light things, nobody can tell. But there have been some experiments where if you take molecules that are in the really, really big end of what we can smell, musks, so you know musks have that like punch in the face quality, right? Like, you know, they smell like a locker room, right? and they're big, heavy molecules. And because they have a whole ton of hydrogen bonds in them, Turin said, okay, if we're substituting in the heavy version of a musk, right, then in theory that should be somewhat more detectable. And it seems like in some tests, in fact, humans can detect that difference. Now there have been a number of back and forth experiments on this question of, right, can we tell this difference? And it seems like in some of them we can, and in some of them we can't. There was a recent replication with honeybees that looked very promising. They could do it. Then somebody else came in and said, wait, maybe there was contamination. I'm not going to jump the gun on the show and tell section, but if you want, you can contribute to this by doing a bit of citizen science. I had a colleague whip me up some deuterated and undeuterited versions of odorants. So they're double-blinded. He has sealed them in the results into an envelope for me, like the Great Kreskin. One of these is diacetyl. That's the chemical that it's the smell of buttered popcorn, basically. It's buttery wholesomeness, but in a molecularly pure form. And the other one is benzaldehyde, which is almond, basically almond smell, right? So if we get to lunch break and people want to come and mark down, you know, they can take a big sniff, nothing toxic here. They can take a big sniff and decide and mark down your results. I brought paper, and we'll see if anybody here can tell the difference reliably at all. We'll get some data out of this. Tell your friends. So we're going to do some show and tell, but that's afterwards. The point is, it's a somewhat contentious theory, but nevertheless, it's a theory which begins to allow us to make very incremental distinctions between chemicals, not simply on the basis of shape, but rather on an independently trackable thing, right, this vibration. And he has some other predictions around this. So for instance, he predicts that if you tweak a molecule in a certain way so that it picks up, it has basically the same vibration as something that would normally contain sulfur, all of a sudden it takes on a rotten egg quality. Likewise, that seems to be borne out. But it's very back and forth. If you look at the science, it's not entirely there, but nevertheless, they haven't knocked it over completely either. Yeah. So, quantum biology, quantum smell, very strange stuff. The reason that this is relevant to us, okay, is that the olfaction, smell receptors, they run on a broad class of receptor, a G protein coupled receptor, okay? And G protein coupled receptors turn up all over the place. And where they turn up really notably, for my purposes here, are neuroreceptors, right? Neurotransmitter receptors are G protein coupled receptors. So my proposition is, if it is the case, okay, that deuteration provides a legitimate way of distinguishing, right? If you can produce this really fine-grained variation between different molecules without altering the electrochemistry, without altering the overall shape, then it becomes possible to create a range of very thin-sliced tools for doing psychedelic neurophenomenology. We can create quantum drugs, where our drugs differ by an amount as small as a single neutron, right? One tiny, tiny mass unit, and thus one small difference in their vibrational frequency. And this suggests an experiment that nobody will let me do yet. But you know, the times are changing. I mean, you know, I know that nobody here has ever had the chance to have psilocybin because mushrooms are illegal. But you know, it's getting to the place now where, you know, actual responsible science is beginning to come out, and hopefully, right, there's room for this kind of science too. So the idea basically is, it's very much like this double-blind study. We would produce a deuterated and an undeuerated version of a very specific, right, agonist. And I'm suggesting a kappa opioid agonist just because it's a specific receptor site. So we produce these two versions of the chemical. We administer them to people who have a certain amount of neurophenomenological training. They can describe their experience reliably. And from that, we see if they can tell the difference and what that difference is, right? It's possible, because it seems like individual neutron differences are detectable in some cases by fruit flies, right? So it's possible that in fact we may be able to get like incredibly fine-grained differences in terms of how these things work, which puts us on a path to actually being able to categorize the dried up finches that we've got instead of just holding them up and saying, look, isn't this weird? So that's the basics of my proposition. Quantum drugs, that's the takeaway, which is clearly what I should have titled my talk, but it sounded so sensational, you know? And there's always the worry that somebody is going to think that I'm pitching my new sequel to The Secret or something. Right. Now, in terms of the sort of experimental paradigm that I would suggest that much of this occurs within, my work with Dr. Vervaeke, you know, involves the examination of altered states, and it involves the relationship between that and mystical experience. And I believe, on the basis of my research, that the kappa opioid receptor has this powerful mediating influence in terms of what's called in the literature fundamental framing, that the way that you construct the categories of your experience, sort of a priori a bit, right, before you have rational thinking and, right, all this other layered stuff, the way that you just construct the basics of the world, the architecture of your experience, relies in some way, shape, or form on the kappa opioid system. I think that kappa opioids probably dismantle that system a little bit. They dismantle your built-up world a little bit. So that what would happen is that they would be the things that would be released to break down your worldview when your worldview became too entrenched for you to solve your problems, right? That is to say, when you are foolish. And so, right, and having the kinds of mystical experiences that people have where they see, you know, they see the world fall into the void, or they feel their ego crumble to bits, right? Now, these kinds of things where it's like a massive, powerful breakdown, the dark night of the soul, right? It can be intensely dysphoric, as the literature quaintly calls it, right? I think that that's what's happening at the kappa opioid receptor. And because of that relationship to fundamental framing, particularly, I also think that being able to incrementally intervene at this site may be the key to developing, sort of both a theory of how these things are functioning, right? But also possibly to developing an entire new kind of intervention, right? And possibly a psychiatric intervention, right? Being able to incrementally break your worldview down when it was getting in your way, which in and of itself, I think, would represent a huge leap beyond where even psychedelic psychotherapy is currently resting. Because right now, psychedelic psychotherapy is basically in sort of one of two camps. There is either the have a big trip camp, right? Ideally under the watchful eye of a trained medical professional, or there is the microdose away, right? And so you get this gradual introduction. That's basically it. And the protocols are as well developed as they could be given the sort of lack of specificity we have, right? It's certainly better than the Leary days where people were busting out of basements and running around on campus. That is not happening so much at Johns Hopkins. But at the same time, you can really see the extent to which we do not have this stuff pinned down and that we're still using broad categories like set and setting. It's like things have not come along significantly in that respect, right? We're just like, well, try not to make it too stressful. And geez, I don't know, think about your life. And good luck, right? As a brief pitch, by the way, to microdosing, we're looking into doing some research in that area, but I actually want to just quickly pitch and say that colleagues of mine are currently doing some survey-based work, and I would encourage everybody, whether you have microdosed, you're interested in microdosing, you've never microdosed, you have no interest in drugs whatsoever, which would not explain why you're here, whatever, I would encourage you all to go to tinyurl.com/ is it microdose or microdosing? I'll flash it up at the end. It's in my slides. Go fill out their survey, do some of this preliminary science so that we can get some sense of how this stuff knits together. And I'm just doing a pitch for other people, research. So, very briefly. Okay, so deuterated agonists is my proposed solution. Bringing this stuff together a little bit, I've mentioned the fundamental framing. And to sort of localize myself, I am very squarely in the John Vervaeke camp of relevance realization is the key to understanding all things, including cognitive science. Okay, I've squarely drunk the Kool-Aid, which I add, very briefly, is an expression that we need to take back, right? Drunk the Kool-Aid used to be a reference to Ken Kesey's Merry Pranksters and the famous account of them, right, which was the electric Kool-Aid acid test, where they, granted irresponsibly, drove around in a bus handing out tabs of acid and dissolved in Kool-Aid. That was drinking the Kool-Aid. It's fun, unless it's traumatic for you, but largely fun. Of course, then we get the Jonestown Massacre. And that ruins drink the Kool-Aid for everybody because, that's awful. But the thing is, it's been 40 years since Jonestown. So I think we can now safely take back drink the Kool-Aid to mean something that's a little bit more positive. Oh, yeah. Okay, so, yeah, but that to say, I'm squarely within the relevance realization camp in this sense, right? That sort of affects how I think these things ought to be approached and how I think they function. But overall, the call that I'm making doesn't necessarily have to operate within that particular paradigm, obviously, right? I think that there's lots of good room for other sort of ways of looking at this stuff that nevertheless is, at the very least, taking an attempt, right? Taking a stab at something more fine-grained than what we have now. There is this real tendency, okay, in drug literature, that is to say the fiction and nonfiction of drug, to have what I sometimes call the wow, ick quality, right? You see it in Fear and Loathing in Las Vegas and Bright Lights, Big City and Confessions of an English Opium Eater and, right, most of these like texts that people really grab onto, Aldous Huxley, less in Doors of Perception, more in Heaven and Hell. And the idea is it's like, right, oh, we show it and it's like, oh, look, it's so weird, and ick, right? Okay, and I think the psychedelic renaissance that we're going through now is to a great extent transcending that by being very, very careful Okay, very, very tentative, very preliminary, and so on and so forth. But there aren't very many efforts yet to try to systematize any of this stuff. You know, I hesitate to say that what we require is unorthodox thinking, but to some extent, right, that's exactly what we need. We need to start thinking about these things in a different way. Not least because it's not just a question of asking how psychedelics themselves are functioning on us, which is pretty mysterious, right? So to draw an analogy here, right, you know, I mentioned the smell of clean. It's a totally novel molecule from the early 20th century. You know what's another totally novel molecule from the early 20th century? LSD. Why is our brain responding to that? Why? We don't know. We don't actually know. And so it would behoove us to try to think about what those mechanisms might be. Why are we able to respond to these novel things? And why does such a small difference in the shape of a molecule, right? Because LSDs 1 through 24 were not that impressive. LSD 25, on the other hand, was like a psychic atom bomb. So what did we do differently? Well, we don't know. Right. So it's not just about inquiring into the nature of psychedelics themselves. It's also, and this really ties into my wheelhouse, about investigating the nature of consciousness, right? Which was, of course, a big part of the original goal of the researchers into psychedelics, right? After we got over this idea that it was all psychotomimetic, it was all, right, emulating psychosis, and, right, we played around with it for a bit trying to figure out what to do with it. There's this huge wave. It's like, wow, this tells us something. It's something really important. But we've sort of stalled out there, right? We're getting a sense of what the sliders are, what are the ranges of variation, right, within consciousness. But perhaps if we can get a really fine-grained tool, we can use psychedelic neurophenomenology to investigate the nature and structure, right, and purpose of consciousness itself, which would be obviously a big deal, right? And to overcome certain problems, right, that up to this point have plagued us. So if you guys are familiar with Chalmers, right, and the hard problem, right, he says, well, fundamentally there is no way to map, right, the objective to the subjective in some sense, right? It's a big argument than that, obviously, P zombies, yada yada, but you know, basically he's getting at this. It's like, no, it's irreducible, experience is irreducible, and that's it. Your qualia, right, the redness of red, you can't map it, give up. But maybe, if we have, instead of plugging away in the dark at a Phillips head screw with a wrench, if we actually had a series of fine tools, we would be able to slowly start to outline things in this incremental way that would allow us to actually construct some theories about how consciousness is functioning, right? Which seems to me like it is a worthwhile goal, not least because my professional career is predicated on it. That is more or less my pitch. My pitch is quantum drugs, folks. And I will, if people want, I don't know, I did not approach the organizers about having a show and tell sniff test. So I suspect I can't do that in this room, but maybe over the course of lunch hour, if people are curious and you want to try to contribute to this question of whether or not you are capable of distinguishing a heavy from a non-heavy version of buttery wholesomeness, I would encourage you to approach me. And like I said, everything is Kreskined into an envelope that I will open after the fact. It's double blind. And I've got booklets that you can mark your results down in. I would be interested to see if anything useful comes out of it, but nevertheless, it's still kind of fun. Yeah, and that is more or less my talk. Thank you. Oh, and yeah, as I said, that tinyurl.com/microdosing. Go fill the survey out. It's 15 minutes. You would be doing science a favor. Do it whether you are interested in microdosing or not, because frankly, at this point, microdosing represents one of the best avenues for sort of advanced research, right? Because you don't have the people escaping from Tim Leary's church basement problem to the same extent. So, and frankly, the advanced research in microdosing seems to be demonstrating that it is a huge, huge potential tool. So the more we get to know about, you know, who is interested in this and what sorts of effects it's having, but also against the baseline, the sooner we can sort of begin to actually look at interventions, et cetera, and hopefully eventually reach a place where mushrooms will not be illegal. All right, so thank you. Did anybody have any questions? Yeah, shoot. You'll have to speak up. I'm partly deaf.
I just want to acknowledge that it was a really difficult decision to decide between going to Dan's lecture this one, and I'm very happy with my choice because that was mind-blowing, so thank you very much.
Okay, good. Thank you. I'm glad. I have to be honest, every time I give a talk of any kind, I just go into a mild speaking trance, and then afterwards I have to ask people whether I actually spoke anything that was coherent at all. Yeah. They assure me I did, but I have no first-person experience of it. Yeah. Yes, in both cases. So they've done some investigations on the European robin, and they have not, to the best of my knowledge, yet discovered the proposed chemical. But what they have done is a bunch of studies where they use certain frequencies of polarized light that would be the frequencies that would polarize the, unentangled electrons that would be free in the atmosphere, and those particular frequencies of light interfere with bird navigation. So they have supporting evidence, but they haven't found the chemical yet. In the case of the fruit flies, I don't know if they've done it with fruit fly receptors, but some of the things that they've done, it's much easier for us to clone receptors now onto things. In fact, the guy who mixed these up for me, my colleague, does work with cloning olfactory receptors into bacteria and then breeding the bacteria. So they've cloned the receptors out and seen if the receptors respond differentially to deuterated olfactants, and thus far, again, the results are very mixed. A bunch of them came up negative, some people are reporting positive. It's kind of all over the place. In terms of the biological mechanism, like I said, Luca Turin specifically has proposed, and his collaborators, have proposed quantum tunneling as how they think this is happening. So they think that when it clicks into place, as it were, it then transfers through quantum tunneling a particular charge packet. Now, I don't know if he speaks at all as to how that impacts phenomenology, right? Like what's happening with the charge packet, that's right? So yeah, personally speaking, I actually don't agree with his quantum tunneling assessment. I don't think that's what the mechanism is. However, I think there is something going on. Like there is enough unexplained data around deuteration that, to me, even if it doesn't turn out to be quantum tunneling per se, we still need something to account for this ability to detect, right, the differences. And so even if that component of it ends up being thrown out, as long as there is a discernible difference, right, then the methodology that I want to import stays the same. So yeah, I don't know. I think they're trying a bunch of cloning, but nothing super definitive yet, so far as I know anyway. Yeah. Yeah. Yes. Yeah, psychoactive terpenes, interesting stuff.
Right. I was wondering how, if you could comment on those chemicals.
Yeah, so I've thought about that a bit. Oh, sorry. The question is, there's been some interesting, recent craze, is a good way to put it, into the effects of terpenes. So terpenes are a class of volatile aromatic chemicals, so that they're smells. So there's been some interest lately in the way that terpenes in things like cannabis may actually be impacting the psychoactive profile of cannabis. So it turns out the smell of your pot is relevant. Above and beyond telling you how skunk or not it is. It turns out that the degree of skunkiness may play some relevant role in terms of its phenomenological impact. To be honest, I've thought about the terpenes thing, and I don't know enough about terpenes overall. The most interesting thing that jumped out to me from the terpene thing was that if you look at the terpene profile on marijuana that is low paranoia, it displays a particular terpene in it that is also extremely chemically rich in black pepper. And I can offer as mostly anecdotal evidence, but something that I would like to test at greater length at some point, that if somebody is having I smoke too much pot and I'm too high freak out, you can crush fresh black pepper under their nose and it calms them right the hell down. So I don't know to what extent that is a placebo effect, which it's very possible it may be, to what extent you're just breaking frame by being like, here, smell a handful of black pepper, and to what extent it may be the terpene profile, but I think there's some suggestive evidence there. I haven't looked at that specifically in terms of deuteration, but yeah, the psychoactive terpenes thing is definitely an interesting sort of, wavefront in this, yeah. In the back. Yes, I am.
So I think some of his research has actually tried deuterating this.
Yeah. So I know that the Shulgins, of course, tried to systematize to a great extent, right? If anybody is interested in this and hasn't read TCAL and PCAL, I would highly recommend them. They're pretty old, but they're also quite interesting, if a bit unsystematic. So I know that there has been some work in that area. Again, the problem that I would have with that is that because it falls prey to the lack of receptor specificity, there's just too much going on to track down the effects in any event, right? And it's too busy. So I think it's interesting, and possibly down the road that's a potential site, but you want to get your first investigations as clean and narrow as possible. And the cleanest, narrowest thing that I can think of is kappa opioid receptors. That's why I'm aiming there. If we can get some kind of general theory, if it turns out there's an effect, right? That's the first caveat. If it turns out there's an effect, and then we can get some kind of general theory out of it, then expanding it outwards and other things that have more receptor sites and activation patterns and, right, are busier in that general sense. Yeah, sure. Yeah. How much time do I have? Oh yeah, I got a few minutes. Cool. Sure. You're welcome. Well, okay, so I'm no expert on terpenes. I know a little bit about terpenes, so I shouldn't speak. Oh yeah, sorry. So if I can broadly say, so talking about terpenes, the question, roughly speaking, is how much of the distinction do you think is based on the differences in the shape in terms of the chemical, and how much of it is the electrochemical difference, or sorry, the mass difference? Yeah, yeah. Right. So the question is, where's the magic? All the way down is the answer. Yeah, again, I don't know. I can't speak to terpenes. And I haven't run these experiments. I've merely proposed them and to give talks about them in an effort to gradually get the zeitgeist to shift in the direction where somebody would let me do those experiments. It's hard to say. My strong suspicion on the basis of what I'm looking at is that there is a vibrational component to the way that these things are functioning. And I suspect that sort of missing angle is going to provide some of the bridge work necessary to getting to the magic, right? It's not going to be magic, but it's going to be pretty magical because, let's face it, lots of those properties they're weird. Right? We all know how weird this stuff is. Quantum stuff, and how weird, the phenomenological stuff. I think we can put it on fairly firm scientific footing, though, right? We can take some of that element out, but how that's going to come out in the balance, I don't know. Hard to say. Yeah.
Maybe when you talk about the receptor specificity problem, with benzodiazepine, where it's benzodiazepine, you see the receiver drugs itself, but that.
Yep.
But the idea being that they belong to not just gamma sites, but specifically gamma sites in the sleep sector because they have stuff on something or whatever.
Yep.
At least that's the theory. Does this do you have a prospect or has there been any murmurings of getting a similar style of drug that we could be finding to beta receptors? So something to say preferentially activate neurons in one part of the finding.
Sure. So the question there was, There's been work with very specific binding sites around recent families of drug developments, like Ambien. And the question was, has there been any work, at least that I'm aware of, in terms of the 5-HT sites and specific binding? The answer is that I know that there's psychopharmacological research at drug companies, as you might expect, right? Because they're trying to nail down specifics within the serotonergic system all the time. And they're throwing billions of dollars. They're also throwing a lot of money on huge computer models, right? And increasingly using machine learning to try to basically crunch the problem space, because nobody can figure it out in any reasonable, systematic way. So yeah, definitely they're looking at specific receptor sites. It's interesting you mentioned Ambien. Thank you. Ambien is actually, in my opinion, a really, really interesting chemical in its own right. For investigating questions of consciousness. So it's got this very specific binding, as you mentioned. But also, if you've ever read accounts of this stuff, Ambien, it's a sleep drug, right? It's a sleep pill. But also there are strange side effects. So people get all kinds of zombie side effects with it, right? So they do lots of sleepwalking, and like sleep making a whole breakfast, and sleep driving their car. And like really, it's not in all cases, but it's sufficiently frequent that it sort of raises some questions. Also, there's an interesting set of experiments where they gave Ambien to people who were in what seemed to be a persistent vegetative state. They were non-responsive and unconscious. And in a certain subclass of those people, it woke them up. Yeah, right? Right. And so there's some thought that maybe what Ambien is doing, insofar as it's interacting at these sites, is somehow returning to people to some kind of consciousness baseline. Well, what does that mean? I don't know. But it is, I think, interesting stuff. So, sorry, that's a tack onto your question. I think they are looking at quite targeted sites. And there has been a little bit of drug development, actually, around the kappa opioid receptor site that I'm interested in. Because it's been noticed that salvinorin A, the active component in salvia, has a powerful antidepressant effect, right? So a single dose of that, right, and 5 minutes of roiling madness, often can significantly alleviate depression in a single dose, and in fact at rates that more or less blow SSRIs out of the water. However, again, all this science is embryonic. You want to know some other things that will immediately alleviate your depression? Mushrooms, LSD, MDMA, ketamine. I mean, at this point, it's just like a fruit salad. We don't know. So, right, we don't know if these things are operating by just like, you're stuck in a rut and it takes a sledgehammer to your the rut that you're stuck in. We don't actually know. But those things are so chemically different that it seems bizarre in some sense that they would all have this significant psychiatric impact. And so, in fact, if you look, the studies are all moving in different directions, right? Everybody is investigating all this stuff to see if, there's something equivalent to an antibiotic that we can develop for depression. A single pill, sit down for 4 hours, think about your life, mystically speaking, and then come out the far side and not feel so bad. Yeah, they've done some development around that for kappa opioid receptors, but the problem they keep running into is dysphoria, which is to say nobody wants to take the pill that makes you feel like shit, and that's what it does, as it stands. The dynorphin, but anyway. And I think I'm sort of out of time. Okay, I still got 5 minutes. I maybe have time for one more question. Sure. Right. Sure. Okay, so the two questions are, what is my specific thesis in this respect, and what are my theories on quantum theories of consciousness? My specific thesis is this, that we have two huge problems in psychedelic neurophenomenology, but that those problems, I think, are actually soluble, right? And right now we're just ignoring the problems, and we're ignoring them because, the data that we get is interesting anyway. It's interesting to have a big glass cabinet full of dried finches, right? But what it isn't is science. Not really. It's naturalism. That's a curio cabinet. And that's where biology was before Darwin. We collected finches, but we didn't have any sense of how any of them were related or how they emerged or what the family structure was, any of that. If you want to get a science, you have to systematize. And that's what I'm saying. If we have to pay attention, basically, to the problems that we're facing in terms of systematizing this stuff if we're going to get anywhere to try to do that. That's my thesis. and I'm making a pitch about how we might do that. What do I think about quantum theories of consciousness? I think most of them are hot garbage. John Vervaeke and I and our collaborator Richard Wu have a theory of consciousness that we've been working out into a proliferating series of papers for submission. I think that most of the quantum theories of consciousness they make the following analogical move. Consciousness is, and I must admit that I maybe made that move a little today, but anyway, consciousness is weird and unexplained. So's quantum mechanics. So obviously they're the same thing. Obviously. And also maybe there's quantum stuff going on in the brain. Okay, and Roger Penrose is probably the most famous proponent of that, but there's a bunch of people, right? There's the Orchor theory and a bunch of those. I think that most of that stuff, it doesn't stand up. It doesn't stand up very well, which isn't to say that I don't think that there might not be some quantum component to the process which produces consciousness, right? I mean, I'm basically making that pitch here. It's just that I don't think that it's useful to just sort of equate those things and then say, they're microtubules and you're collapsing wave functions and look, you make your own reality and ... the secret. That's what I think. So, okay, thank you very much.